Hello, welcome back. We are with OBJ 2 in our lesson packet today. OBJ 2 is all about the Declaration of Independence, which is one of my favorite topics in history, because essentially the Declaration of Independence is just one of the most well known and best written breakup letters of all time. And I'm going to explain how in just a second. So, as a quick reminder, okay, we're going to flash back to our footsteps. The center of the rebellion and the American Revolution is taking place in Boston. Remember, they're the troublemakers. Boston, Massachusetts was the colony at the center of the rebellion happening throughout all of the colonies. Word of the actions and problems with the British spread through the committees of correspondence and groups like the Sons of Liberty. So there were a lot of radical revolutionaries in Boston at the time. They really wanted to be their own country. They were um, they were vehemently protesting British occupation. Um, and so they started to act out. Okay, remember things like the Boston Tea Party. We get this cartoon called Join or Die, where basically they're saying, like, all of the colonists need to join in the movement um, towards revolution. And so Boston is really the center of where the rebellion is taking place. Remember the Boston Massacre. Okay, they're angry. 5 colonists died when they were protesting, their unhappiness with how they were being treated by the British. And remember, we're using this background is the engraving done by Paul Revere, and we have to remember that this one is very historically biased because we know the colonists were not innocent in this incident, but they were definitely unhappy with the British. And it is true that 5 of them died, most likely because they were armed with snowballs and sticks, and the British had bayonets. So the Boston Massacre made them even more angry. The Boston Tea Party, where they throw $1 million worth of British tea overboard. This was to protest the Sugar Act, okay, because um, they were importing molasses, and there was a tax on sugar and molasses. Well, the Sugar Act actually made sugar and molasses cheaper for colonists. But the reason they were so upset is because they were actually smuggling tea, or they were smuggling in, yes, tea, sugar, and molasses from the Dutch, and they were avoiding the tax altogether. Well, when the king figured out this was happening, he wanted to capitalize on it. So he put a stop to the smuggling, which upset a lot of colonists because now tea, molasses, and sugar are going to be more expensive. Even though the tax technically went down, they were never paying it in the first place because they were smuggling Dutch tea in. So now they have to pay just a tax in general, which raises the cost, and they were super unhappy about it. So to protest it, they poured all of this British tea in the ocean, which was $1 million worth. It was a lot of money. And they were basically like, screw your British tea. We're going to keep smuggling it in from the Dutch. Then a reminder, we have the shot heard around the world. We get Lexington and Concord. Remember, the British are trying to take their weapons, which has a lot of influence on, when we think about the rights we have in the United States today. There is a lot of influence from this moment in our Bill of Rights, particularly the Second Amendment, which allows you to bear arms, right, to own weapons. Colonists were terrified because the British could take their weapons away from them at any point in time. And so they specifically added that into our Constitution because of instances like this that took place in the 1770s, before we were our own country. And I believe my camera just went out, but hopefully you can still hear me. All right. They were hoping there was still a chance to avoid war after Lexington and Concord. Things really just took off and fighting spread throughout all of the colonies, where these Minutemen, these colonial militias, were basically going after the British and the British going after them. But a lot of colonists still hoped that the British would change their trade and tax policies. Remember, we gave them the olive branch petition to basically say, hey, we're still willing to work things out with you, But King George was not going to compromise in any way, shape, or form. It was going to be, you're going to pay whatever we say you're going to pay, and you're going to follow whatever laws I create because I'm the king. And that's what Parliament has decided. And so really there was no hope. He was refusing to listen to any of the compromises that, colonists were willing to make. And they actually only hardened their position. They were steadfast in saying basically like, no, like you're going to do what we tell you to do. So then we get Thomas Paine, who writes Common Sense. Remember, it is the best-selling book in American history. It sold 500,000 copies. It was super popular. Everybody was reading it. In the play Hamilton, which we will watch, you can hear, there's one section where Angelica in the very beginning of the play is like, I've been reading Common Sense by Thomas Paine, because it was really popular. Everybody was reading it. I like to call him T-Pain for short. But yeah, he very much so ignited a spark in the American Revolution by arguing, hey, it doesn't make sense for us to be ruled by a country 3,000 miles away. Common Sense sold, that's a typo. It's supposed to say 500,000 copies in the colonies. But he wrote Common Sense in a very particular way because he wanted to reach as many people as he possibly could. So he wrote it in an informal manner so that anyone could understand it. And so anybody who is reading that, even if you didn't have a great education, you could read it and understand the conflict between Britain and the colonies. It didn't use Greek or Latin, but it also referenced the Bible, which, keep in mind, was very much so how people lived their lives at the time. So what's really interesting is that a lot of these colonists who did not want to go to war against Britain really didn't understand the gravity of what was happening between the colonies and Britain because they couldn't read. Because traditionally, things were printed in Greek or Latin. And that's difficult because in order to read that, you had to have gotten an education, which at the time was not very common. A lot of people just kind of worked on farms. So that's when I made this PowerPoint, the Barbie movie was very popular. But what did he say in the movie? He said something like, "My job is just pool," or something like that. So to the colonists, their job just farm. Okay, that's all they really knew. But Thomas Paine revolutionized like how people could be a part of the revolution by writing it in language that everybody could understand, even if they didn't have access to an education. This is a sign that's up. I believe it is in somewhere in Pennsylvania. That's where a lot of the American Revolution took place. There's all kinds of these signs around there to mark like historic American history events or important places. It's really cool. But basically the argument is that everything that is right or reasonable pleads separation from England. Essentially, what that means is there is literally no reason for us to stay part of England. Not one reason besides being fearful of being killed by the king. And so it's common sense to separate. And Common Sense had an incredible impact on the colonies. It definitely put further strain on the relationship between Britain and the colonies because it, again, radicalized more people to want to be part of the revolution. And then finally, the Second Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which we talked about last time, instructed Thomas Jefferson to draft a Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Jefferson was part of the southern colonies. I can't remember which one he was from in particular. I want to say Virginia. Yeah, but I'm not sure about that. But he basically was given the task of drafting this letter telling the king, all right, we are officially as of today our own country and we want nothing to do with England. And so to do that was an act of treason. So essentially the penalty for this was death. So anybody who signed this was basically saying like, we're either going to win or we're going to die. That was basically their two options. And that is the That is the Declaration of Independence in the bottom left-hand corner. So yeah, super important to know that Thomas Jefferson was the one that wrote it. Except he wrote, they made him write a lot of different versions of it, and he'd write one, and he'd bring it back, and they'd be like, change this, 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 and this, and then he'd refix that, and then he'd write it again, and then he'd bring it back, and then they fix this, 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 and this. Because remember, they wanted to be absolutely perfect, because to the rest of the world, again, they don't want to look like these crazies who are overthrowing their government for no reason. They wanted to have a very clear statement explaining why they are declaring independence against England. So this is Independence Hall. These are pictures that I took. I went there and saw this room and took pictures of it because I thought it was really cool. But this is the exact room where they signed and drafted the Declaration of Independence. So this is where they met during the Continental Congress. And obviously the furniture in here is mostly just like made up to kind of show you what it would have looked like. They used like historical primary sources in order to get the best idea of what it might have looked like inside and then designed it like that. But if you look in the very back, this chair at the like table that's in the center there, that is the original chair that George Washington sat in when they met for the Continental Congress and declared independence. So that is the literal chair from 1776 that he sat in, which is kind of crazy. And then I just wanted to show you, like, this is what a printer looked like back then. So, like, essentially what they would do is they'd take like this wooden contraption, and it was basically just a giant stamp. So they would take ink, which is these little blotters to the left hand side here. You can kind of see them. They'd stamp the bottom with a bunch of ink, and then they would close the lid and stamp like the whatever they wanted to write onto the paper, and that's how they like mass produced copies. So this would have been how Common Sense was published or printed. All right, so the Declaration of Independence, it was written to ensure to the world, that mostly Britain and Spain, that the colonists had educated reasons why they wanted to declare their independence, meaning they don't want to be looked like as crazies who are just overthrowing their government. I'm going to say that a million times because truly that's really why they wrote as much as they did and why we have such good documentation of it. These are men of the Enlightenment. We already talked about that. They put everything into writing, and this is the ultimate breakup letter, because it's basically saying, England, it's you, not me. This is what Independence Hall looks like from the outside in Philadelphia. So that room that I showed you, this is what the outside of that building looks like. Still looks like this today. And then Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration, he proposed his first draft of the Declaration on June 28th, 1776. And they were like, nah, bro, you got to go back and fix these things. So he goes back and he writes another draft. And the final draft was accepted on July 4th, 1776. So they made him revise it for like a month. Well, no, that's not a month, a couple weeks. So if you're wondering why we celebrate the 4th of July, is because this is the official day that we declared ourselves our own country. And it was a difficult decision. A lot of colonists didn't think that declaring their independence from Britain was necessary or the right thing to do. They're scared. But as the delegates, which are like the representatives from each colony, met in the Second Continental Congress, when they counted the votes, because they literally voted who wants to declare independence, it became very clear that all of the colonies were wanting to declare independence from England. So this is actually the votes. This chart shows the votes from what's it called? For who wanted to, I'm having a brain fart, for who wanted to declare independence. So you could see Pennsylvania had the highest amount of votes, and Rhode Island, kind of fake, only 2 votes, but yet they still voted for independence. There are 5 parts to the Declaration of Independence. Remember, these guys like to write. They have something to say. So it is quite long. There's 5 main parts. Part 1 is the introduction. And basically, this is where they introduce why they are writing this document. So they basically are just saying why they're issuing a Declaration of Independence. One of the most famous quotes from part 1 is, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. And what that means in modern day English, it's like when push comes to shove, we got to tell you why we want to separate from. This is to tell you why we want to separate from England. Part 2 is their actual argument. This is their reasoning behind it. In this part, the signers of the document make their argument that citizens have the right to self-government. Remember, that was a huge problem. They had no representation in parliament. And so they are basically saying, as a human being, we have the right to make decisions for ourselves in our government. They have the right to pick and be part of the government that rules over them. If the people's natural rights are being taken away, they have the right to revolt against the government. These are all the reasons that they give for why they want to be an independent nation. They argued that their natural rights were being taken away and therefore they have no choice. This is the best quote from part 2, or the most famous quote, and you'll hear this in Hamilton too. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. So again, in modern English, it's basically saying we are equal to the British. Keep in mind, they are not including people of color or women in that statement whatsoever. But they're basically saying we as white colonists are equal to the British. Remember, they were not treated as equal to the British. And we have rights that you cannot take away from us: life, liberty, and happiness. And if we are not getting those rights, or those rights are being taken away from us, we have the right to redo our government. Because the power of the government should come from us, the people. Part 3 is where they complain. And then basically part 3 is just a list of complaints that they launch against the king in parliament. And they list 27 total complaints, which is crazy. Wild. They had a lot to say. Part 4 is called the refusal to change. So this part is a statement saying that the king and parliament have refused to change their policies. So they're basically like, this is why we want to separate. Here are our reasons. Here are our complaints with Britain. And here's the part where I say, I've tried to figure it out. We've tried to compromise, but they refuse to change. So a quote from this part is, in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So they're basically saying, we've tried to work with you. You won't. You're acting like a tyrant that is only hell-bent on getting their way. So you can no longer be our leader. And then part 5 is the declaration. In this part, the colonies declare their independence from Britain officially. Mic drop. Okay? We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to our supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. So he's basically saying, we're done being a part of Britain. We're breaking up with you. We are our own country. we're going to do what countries do, and we're going to make alliances, which we do. We're going to declare war, which we do. And we're going to do other things that countries do when they're independent countries. And lastly, we get the signatures. The Declaration is signed by 56 people in Liberty Hall who were the representatives for each colony. So those representatives that voted for the revolution, they put their name on the document saying, here's my name, you know exactly who I am, and come and stop me, basically. Which is really cool because they knew they were basically signing their lives away on this document, because if they failed, they were dead. And as you can see on the left-hand side, John Hancock has the largest signature, which very much matches his personality. He, like I said earlier, was a tea smuggler and a molasses smuggler. He hated the British because he was one of the most wealthy men in all of the colonies. And he had a big, boisterous, fancy personality. Like, he loved life's riches. So when the British created the Sugar Act, he took personal offense because he was all about his bag. He was in his bag. He wanted lots of money. He was making lots of money, and he didn't want anything to disturb his business. And so John Hancock was King George's number one hater. And so when he signed the Declaration of Independence, he signed it as big as he possibly could. So now there's like a saying when you need, like, if somebody needs you to sign something, they'll say, all right, go ahead and put your John Hancock right here, because he has the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. And this is the Declaration of Independence. And as you can see at the bottom, I don't know if it's showing for you. On my end, it's a GIF, but it basically shows the signatures in the order of which they were signed. John Hancock was also first. So yeah, that says a lot about him. All right, you guys, that's it for OBJ2.